here too. We're happy to have Trevor Taylor from Parks Department. He's going to tell us a little bit about himself and then about the creek that we all love so much. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
So my name is Trevor Taylor. My job title is I work in the Parks and Open Space Division, which is a division within Public Works for the City of Eugene, and I'm the Natural Areas Restoration Supervisor. Long title. Basically, I have a staff of biologists, and we manage a lot of the city's natural areas. Amazon Creek, Willamette River, Ridgeline, West Eugene Wetlands, a lot of the sort of pocket parks like Tugman Park, which has a nice little natural area and a creek flowing through it, places like that. So we take care of those places. We do a lot of restoration projects. We grow native plants. We do a whole variety of things that I won't get into today. I've been working with the city for coming up on 16 years, and actually started, my very first project was when I was hired. My primary job was to develop a management plan for Amazon Creek. So I've been thinking about and working in Amazon Creek that whole time, and things have changed a lot during that period of time, for the better, I hope. That's what we've been trying to do. And I'll talk tonight a little bit about some of the history going back quite a ways, as far as we know at least. Some of the history is lesser known, but I'll talk about as much as I do know. Talk a little bit about biology, and actually talk a little bit about hydrology in there too. I didn't list that, but it relates very much to the biology and the history. The hydrology has been dramatically altered. And then I'll talk a bit about management and how we're managing it, some of the things, the guiding principles that we use for managing it, and then after that, hopefully we'll have some discussion and questions, and I'd love to hear from you guys what you're thinking about and questions you might have. So Eugene, these are some of the larger sub-basins in Eugene. We're talking tonight about the Amazon Basin. It's one of the larger basins. It starts in the very top of Spencer Butte. Rainwater that lands on the north side of the peak of Spencer Butte flows down this way into Amazon Creek, and the ridgeline. It's got the ridgeline is the southern boundary of it. So all the rain that falls on the north side of the ridgeline flows into Amazon Creek. You can see it flowing, right here, and then it's got a little bit of flow from the north side, but there's a break here, kind of through the middle of town, where other water flows the other direction towards the Willamette River. So that's the watershed. And an interesting thing to just note on this image, I'm going to move to a different image here in a minute, but you can actually see all the waterways that are open on this image. So all these little blue things, and it's hard to see them all, I understand that. These are open waterways currently. And one thing you'll note, there's these little headwater stream remnants that are left, and most of them are kind of, the open ones are higher up in the watershed. Then they go into a pipe, and that pipe comes down and dumps into Amazon Creek. So you'll see that Amazon Creek actually isn't connected to very many of those headwater streams, at least not on a surface flow. There's a lot of underground flow. This is a very developed area, and a lot of our storm water goes through pipes into Amazon Creek, and I'll talk about what that means a little bit. So there it is, zoomed in, so actually you can see it a little bit better. You can see some of these little headwater streams that are remnants left that are still open, and then they go into a pipe here and flow down. And so some of the headwater streams up here in the southern end of the watershed are actually still quite open, and that's what a lot of that effort around protecting the property that was formerly owned by the Beverly family and now in city ownership was about protecting some of those headwater streams. And you can see there's quite a few headwater streams still open in their entirety that connect to the main stem in that upper part of the watershed. Here's another image that sort of highlights it. I don't really like this image very much, but I grabbed it out of a document that we have because it really makes the waterways pop. It's talking about riparian zones, so I thought maybe as far as images you could see it. And what I want to show here is just kind of, we'll walk all the way down Amazon Creek here in a minute, but I just want to show you, it kind of flows here. This is, a parkway through Amazon Park. Then it enters the concrete portion. Most people are familiar with that. Comes out around the fairgrounds, kind of works its way through town again, pretty developed, pretty urban, opens up quite a bit in the West Eugene wetlands, and then something very odd happens to it. And just, I'll talk about some of these little feeders. So this is Willow Creek. This is the Willow Creek drainage. And there's quite a few headwater streams that feed into Willow Creek. This is the Roosevelt Channel. And it's also called the A2 that's what the Army Corps of Engineers named it when they built it. And it feeds in. And then this is actually a creek called Dead Cow Creek that feeds in. And then right here you see it splits, and that is very odd. You don't usually see streams that are going downstream split and go into two different directions. And what's happening there is it's entering the diversion channel. So the Army Corps of Engineers constructed a lot of Amazon Creek, or at least they redirected it and did a lot of construction around Amazon Creek. And they wanted to get water out to Fern Ridge. So what happens here is this is the historic channel of Amazon Creek here. It flows out towards the Long Tom and eventually feeds into the Long Tom. Right at this point here on Royal, the Army Corps of Engineers has constructed a weir. And that weir is very highly engineered. It's under different flows. It backs up water in certain volumes and pushes water this direction. And actually, it's technically flowing uphill. You'll see some pictures here in a minute where the water in Amazon Creek is higher than the land outside. It's held in a channel with levees that are holding the water in there. It does flow downhill that whole time, but it's above the level of the ground so that it can make it all the way out to Fern Ridge. It's kind of a weird little feature. Another very odd feature, and actually I'll just mention this as an aside. Notice the Bethel-Danabo watershed crosses Amazon watershed. You never see that. And the reason is that this Bethel-Danabo, all the water from this flows here, and then there's a siphon that goes underneath the diversion channel and pops out the other side and sends the water on to the rest of the watershed. So these two watersheds cross. So a lot of engineering, a lot of very unusual hydraulics going on with Amazon Creek and its basins. William wanted me to show this just to kind of give you some context, I think. So this is the area where we're going to really kind of focus on today, is really kind of the upper Amazon, the area in the neighborhoods around here. You can see Amazon Park, Amazon Parkway. It comes up to Frank Kinney Park. There's the headwaters. We're kind of right here right now near Tugman Park. And I'm going to give you some images of what it looks like. We'll start on the upper end. This is the Amazon headwaters. It's much more natural. It's kind of cascading. This is what the channel used to look like. Very little of these headwater streams have been manipulated, or at least not very manipulated. Many of them are still in fairly natural alignments. Then as you cross Martin, it goes through a culvert under Martin Street, and between Martin and Snell, there's a channel that's relatively similar to what it was historically. The Army Corps of Engineers did not do any manipulations there. However, historically, farmers did. So it has been ditched, it has been deepened, and it has been straightened, but not by engineers, just by farmers who'd lived there historically. And you'll note that because a lot of the trees are quite large there. If you were to look from the air or even an air photo, you'll see there's a lot of larger trees between Martin and Snell, and then after Snell, they start to drop. They start to get a little smaller. This is Snell to Fox Hollow. When I first started working here, there were no trees. It was mowed down to the water. It was just grass. And that was one of the first changes that we made, was to stop mowing that and to stop. The Army Corps of Engineers really wanted us. Their management plan, their maintenance plan for the creek says mow it down to the nubbins all year long to the water's edge, no trees, no shrubs. And they had a variety of reasons for doing that we understand better now, I think. So there's a lot of these trees aren't that old. Fox Hollow to 30th, these are probably familiar to you as far as images of what it looks like. It looks pretty similar. It's nice willow population. And this picture is actually probably 7 or 8 years old. Those trees are a lot larger now. Yeah, these are a little bit older photos. 30th to 24th through the park. Yeah, it's really quite large now. And then we hit the concrete. This was, back then, when in the 50s even, downtown, this area was pretty urbanized already. A lot of people owned property and had developed property right up to the edge of the creek. So the Army Corps of Engineers designed it this way to really constrain the creek, and it's meant as a flood control facility. That was the primary purpose for that, for all of the work that the Army Corps of Engineers did. Then you come out and you get into, I don't have a lot of photos from this whole next section because it's not our focus, but this is relatively typical of what it looks like after it leaves the concrete and goes from the fairgrounds out towards West Eugene wetlands. There's a lot of development along the edges of it. A lot of property owners own the creek itself. They own out into the creek, or they own across the creek. We don't own all of it. We do have easements through the whole thing, so we can do management, and when I get to management, I'll talk more about that. But it's pretty constrained. And then we got to West Eugene, and it's like, whew, we can breathe again. So the creek can move around. The West Eugene Wetland Plan and all of the acquisition that occurred through the West Eugene Wetland Partnership over the past 25 or 30 years has purchased quite a bit of property around Amazon Creek and a lot of wetlands there. So and reconnected, a lot of restoration has reconnected the creek with the wetlands. So in high water, this is flowing across this entire wetland, and it's connected with the wetland. It's connected with its floodplain. A lot of water treatment happens then. A lot of water quality improvements occur. A lot of infiltration. Quite a bit of hydrology is happening out when you get to the wetlands. But then when you hit Royal, you go into the levee system if you're on the diversion channel. And this is where I was talking about. The water here is actually higher than the adjacent land. It's held back by these levees. And this is the area that the Army Corps of Engineers they've kind of backed off, and they've said, well, really what we need you to do is manage this area, for the trees and shrubs. And the bigger issue is they don't want a big tree. If we had a big tree growing on this levee and it fell and took the levee out with it, all that water would come pouring out and flood the property owners nearby. Similarly, large trees and shrubs, their roots, if let's say the tree died, their roots rot, and there's a channel for water to come through, and it would, they call it piping. And just like through a dike, if you start getting a little hole, pretty soon it's raging. So they have a lot of concerns around how we manage this area, and there's a lot of oversight about how we manage it. We've come to some agreements. There's a lot of conflicting regulations. The Army Corps of Engineers comes in with their safety regulations. We also have endangered species all over the levee and all around the levee, so the Endangered Species Act is important. And then we're also being regulated by the Clean Water Act. So we have temperature and clean water issues we're trying to address, which are completely in conflict with having this open to the sun. Having shade on it would help with temperature. So all of these federal regulations and regulators are in conflict in terms of the objectives and goals that they have. So we're trying to weave our way through all of that and have some pretty good ways that we do that, I think, to find that balance. So I'll show you some historic photos a little bit. This is not a historic photo. This is an air photo, and just to orient you a little bit. So this is the Frank Kinney Park area. These are the headwaters. Here's the two forks of Amazon Creek that come together and then flow down between East and West Amazon Parkway. So people kind of oriented. And the reason I want to show you this shape, and then the other one to watch is, this is Old Dillard, right? So here's 1940. You can see what it used to look like. So it's already been kind of farmed in this area. It's been deepened and straightened a little bit. But it's pretty wide. You can see here it almost disappears. And I'll show you an image of what I think this area probably looked like prior to development, prior to any development. And you can see the road here, the same. And you can see these forks, those two forks that are still open, and the headwaters, what they look like. And you can see there's not as many trees there as there are now. And then you can see another thing. This fork disappeared. I don't see this one actually, or this one. I'm sorry, these are the two forks that currently exist. 1957, you start getting houses and roads, a little bit more. You got East and West Parkway already. Here's Frank Kinney Park. You can see here's the two forks that come in currently to the main channel. Here's a couple of additional forks that we don't have anymore. And you can see it's already been straightened. I believe this is about the time, if not right I think it's right after or about the time that the Army Corps is doing their work. I think it was early 50s is the records that I have that Army Corps was doing their deepening and sort of building their trapezoidal channel to try and reduce flooding. And I'll show you the reason that they did this. Well, I'll show you in a little bit. But so this is a little bit closer to now. This is that same photo that we started with, but I sort of put on it where the historic channels were. And these two, like I said, are still here. This one's gone. There's houses sitting on top of it, you can see, and this one's pretty much gone. It may be up in here and then hit a culvert or something here. I haven't actually explored up in this area, but it's pretty developed. Oh yeah, so here's the example that I wanted to give you. So if you can imagine this area here and kind of Amazon Park, when the water came down off of this sort of steep area and hit this flatter area, these areas were primarily what we call wetland prairie, very open, dominated the Willamette Valley. The Willamette Valley had a tremendous amount of wet prairie habitat in it. It's almost all gone. We're down to about 1/10 or 0.2% of wetland prairie that was here historically. A lot of it was maintained by Native Americans through burning, or at least it burned pretty frequently to keep it open, to keep it treeless. And most of what remains is actually here in the Eugene area. So those West Eugene wetlands have some of the highest quality and some of the largest blocks of remaining wetland prairie. So if you do have a chance to go out there, you can really appreciate them and realize that that's it. And you look all the way to Portland, there's a few other hot spots. Finley Wildlife Refuge is another hot spot, but it's gone pretty much. And so the plants that you're seeing there, that's some of the last remnants of them. And the reason I mention that is that I think that this area, even here probably, and definitely below, probably looked a little bit more like our wetland prairies now that are still in good condition. This is a picture of an area that it's called Coyote Prairie. It's a wetland that the city owns and has been restoring. And you get these little tiny surface channels that flow through it. They're very shallow, they're meandering, they're spread out. The whole thing is wet. You walk across this and you're going to be squishing through mud right here, even in the area that looks kind of dry. So that's probably what it was like. It was this big, expansive wetland that was wet 9 months of the year and very difficult to farm, very difficult to travel through, very difficult for horses to get through, for cars to get through, and for people to live on. So that's why the Army Corps was really coming in here. They were like, you can't live here, you can't build here, you can't have development or infrastructure or economy in an ecosystem that is, so difficult to get through. And I understand that because I walk through this a lot, and it's very difficult to walk through. I get exhausted at the end, and we can't take vehicles in there. We can't move around. Even with like a four-wheel drive ATV, we end up getting stuck. So I understand what life was like back then and how happy they were to have things drained. However, now that we're looking back, we're like, oh, all that we lost in that process, and how can we get that back, or how can we find a way to live in a little bit more balance? So hydrology, one of the things I really wanted to talk about, and this isn't specific to, this is really any urban area. You get a lot of concrete, you get a lot of roads, sidewalks, roof structures, even, packed in, baseball fields are pretty compacted. And what happens is you get a very different hydrology in your creek. A typical creek, and so you don't have to understand this very, very much. There's too much detail here to really get into, but really this is how much water there is in the creek, and this is time. And we're going to start with time 0 being it starts raining. It starts raining, and a typical creek is like this green part of the graph here. It starts raining, things get wet, leaves are catching water, there's lots of space on it. It starts to infiltrate. It's like a big sponge. It really soaks it up, and it keeps raining. And it finally makes its way down. It takes time for it to filter through those wetlands to get to the creek. And slowly the creek rises, and then the rain event stops. The rain event probably stopped somewhere here, but still the creek rises, and it slowly comes down. That's a typical hydrograph for a natural stream. What you get in an urban setting is it starts raining, it hits concrete, it shoots down the concrete very quickly, goes into a pipe, and jets out to the Amazon Creek. Just, minutes. And so it starts raining, and Amazon Creek, it'll rise 5 or 6 feet in just an hour or less even. And then the rain ends, and it drops down. You see right now we had all that rain this last weekend. The Amazon Creek was overflowing in West Eugene. Many of the bike paths were under. You go out there now and there's about less than a foot of water in it. So that's one of the things that happens, and it has important impacts biologically. Not just the hydrologic impact is affecting biology. And so so we'll talk about plants for a minute. So one of the things that it does, that hydrology does, is it favors, reed canary grass really likes that kind of disturbance. A lot of plants can't take that, I'm going from totally crispy dry to being underwater and then crispy dry again. That's just too much of a dramatic change in too short of a time for a lot of plants to tolerate. But reed canary grass does pretty well in it. So we do have reed canary grass all up and down the creek. It's not the only reason that we have it. It's a very aggressive and plant for a lot of other biological reasons. But the hydrology certainly contributes to that. A couple things that are unique about the Upper Amazon Parkway area that I think are kind of cool. One are the oaks. Usually when we have riparian areas, like if you go along the Willamette River or a lot of other rivers, you'll see these, you see cottonwoods and alders and willows and ash. And then some of these areas along the Upper Amazon here, you get these big oaks at the top of in the riparian zone, which is kind of unusual because oaks like it dry. Maybe they're young, maybe they came in later, but we do have a few other examples of that type of habitat, which is kind of unique in West Eugene, kind of on the Coyote Creek waterway in particular. Coyote Creek has a lot of oaks along it. And there's only a couple of creeks that I know of that have oaks along the banks of it. So I think that's kind of a unique feature of this stretch of Amazon Creek. Adjacent to it, as I mentioned, was wet prairie, and we still have a few remnants of wet prairie. They're a little tight, they're a little constrained, but we do have wet prairie left, and technically all the soils are still in place. We do have the hydrology, and we do have some of the plants. It's mostly dominated by non-native plant species. It's just been hammered by over too long through grazing and mowing and other dumping and just general neglect. But we do have remnants, and in this picture here, for example, you can see there's a lot of buttercups. All that yellow is buttercup. There are some patches of camas along the Amazon Parkway area. We have a few patches of the native milkweed that are left, which is kind of neat. That's the host plant for the monarch butterfly, which is people have been listening, it's been in rapid and dramatic decline around the world. And this is the host plant for it. And there's a few patches of it left on Amazon Creek, which is kind of neat, and only in this upper section. And then again in West Eugene wetlands, we have it also, but there's kind of these two pockets. And then a kind of really cool thing about the upper Amazon Creek is this little plant right here. This is different, so that's buttercup. But this one here, you can start to see how it's different, is Bradshaw's lomaceum. And that's an endangered plant. It's on the endangered species list. It's been federally protected as endangered for a long time. And we have some of the largest populations left in the world. And Amazon Park, actually, of all places, is one of the largest populations left in the world. It's, John probably knows, 35,000, 40,000 plants there, I think. And it was started out when 15 years ago, I think it was about 2,500 plants. So it's been getting better and better through management. And now this plant is almost ready to be delisted. Within our region, so there's different regions where it's endangered. Our region, we have achieved the adequate population to delist it from the Endangered Species Act, except for one element. The way that it's listed is not just numbers of plants, but also the quality of the habitat within which it lives. We've achieved numbers of plants, so the population is actually large enough to delist, but the adjacent habitat has not been restored adequately. So like Amazon Park's a good example. Great population of Bradshaw's lomaceum, but very poor habitat around it. It's all tall fescue, very limited biodiversity. So that's another thing we'll be working on. There's a little tiny population of it here by 35th place on the east Amazon side. So if you're ever walking around there, you might find there's about 30 or 40 plants in a little area right next to a telephone or a power pole that we keep track of. What else? But most of it is pretty beat up. There's a little bit of checker mallow along there, which is an important host plant. But mostly it's been a lot of the plant community has been lost. Okay, whoops. Let's talk about aquatic wild. Let's talk about wildlife. So Pacific chorus frogs, really big in Amazon Park. I'm sure you guys have heard that. You can hear it probably outside right now. You can hear it from miles away. That population is extremely large and really healthy and robust. The wetland right behind the pool was a restored wetland. That was one of the first projects I worked on, and is really a good example of what historic wetland prairie used to look like. It's got a lot of the biodiversity and structure that was historic there, and it's got a great population of chorus frogs. We get otter all the way up here. I get reports every year of people like, hey, there's an otter in the Amazon Creek by Amazon Park. And they don't hang out, they don't live here, but they're definitely foraging all the way up the creek to all the way up here. I haven't seen or heard of beaver up this far. I've seen them as far as the fairgrounds. Maybe they don't like the concrete section or something, but there are some pretty good mammals all the way up here. In the creek itself, so talking about macroinvertebrates, which are insects, aquatic insects, they're kind of the foundation of the food chain in streams. Most of the aquatic invertebrates in Amazon Creek are pretty poor. And part of that is it's two things. One, it's this trapezoidal channel that was constructed, very straight walls, very straight bottom. There's not a lot of complexity. They like if you look in a stream, it's very complex. There's rocks, there's boulders, there's riffles and pools and side channels. All of that complexity really helps create biodiversity for aquatic insects. So that's lacking. Also, this channel is built in clay. Most of the soils are wetland soils or clay soils, and that what happens is you get it's not a great substrate, and then also what happens is it's really really small and light, so as it comes into the water column, it stays in the water column, so you get this really muddy water until it gets to Fern Ridge and can slow down and all that clay can drop out. So that lack of complexity. The places where we have added complexity back, so if people have seen Frank Kinney Park, if you've been here a while, you saw that we did a large restoration project there several years ago and added some meander and put some rocks and boulders and logs in. The macroinvertebrate population there is really great. And then you just go a few blocks down and there's hardly any. So, or at least the macroinvertebrate population there is very limited in terms of diversity.
Where was it that you did it? That you improved it? Where? At
At Martin
Martin Street?
Street. So when you're standing at Martin Street and right at Frank Kinney Park there, it's all forested now. It's really hard to kind of see. But if you were to go in the channel, you'd see the channel meanders, and there's a lot of rocks in there, and there's actually some logs that were placed in there sort of strategically.
Is the dragonfly population an indication of health of the stream at that point?
It could be. Adult dragonflies can move pretty far, but the nymphs are. That's a good because they're high on the food chain. They need a lot of. They're eating all the small things and all the diversity. So yes. And then, of course, Amazon Creek is a good corridor for birds, especially songbirds. And the important thing to really think about, that at least I think about, is you have this ridgeline system that's really nice and forested, and then you have Amazon Creek, and then you get out to the West Virginia wetlands, and that is really the connection to the West Virginia wetlands. It's this major corridor where wildlife and fish and macroinvertebrates are moving up and down, and even through the concrete section. So it's this big, important way that migration and genetic connectivity still occurs between these two large kind of anchor ecosystems. So that's just something to think about. So what else about wildlife? What about the nutria? We have nutria. They are not native, obviously. They cause a lot of problems. They're not the worst thing in the world. The biggest problem they cause for us is they cause a lot of bank failure because they burrow into the banks. And that highly engineered trapezoidal structure, then you've got a house right here at the top of it. When that bank fails, it puts those houses in risk because suddenly the creek is like free to start moving around again. It's like, whoa, yeah. and puts a lot of this private property and infrastructure at risk. So that's the main issue that we have with nutria, is that they cause structural damage to the channel that's caused problems. They eat people's gardens too, and I had somebody call me and tell me it attacked his dog. Anyway, they're not native, and they're here, and they're not going anywhere. So one thing I did want to talk about was crayfish. This is something we've just learned about recently, the past couple of years. This red swamp crayfish, in particular, has been moving up the Willamette River over time. And we didn't think it was here. In fact, so Chris Pearl with the U.S. Geologic Survey, he's a specialist in crayfish, is one of the things he does. And he thought it had stopped at Fern Ridge Reservoir, that the dam there was maybe a barrier because he hadn't found it above that. I had a couple of students at the South Eugene High School just doing an environmental studies project, and they caught a whole bunch of them in Amazon Creek at Amazon Park there. So they're here. And the issue is they're very large, and they're extremely aggressive and active. I mean, it's funny. I had Chris bring in several of these crayfish, the native crayfish and the red swamp crayfish. And the native crayfish just kind of sit there in the water, and they're really kind of hanging out. And this thing's like active, and it's trying to crawl out, and it's flipping, and you grab it, and it's flapping, and it's just super active and aggressive, and it kills and chases out the native crayfish. So most of the native crayfish populations are at significant risk, if not mostly extirpated at this point, I'm sure.
Where's it from?
I don't know. Red swamp. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Okay, so planning. Let me see where we are here. 7:40. Okay. We have lots of time. 20 minutes. Okay, so planning. I want to talk a little bit about how we make decisions. The Comprehensive Stormwater Management Plan back in 1993 still is one of our guiding principal documents, and it outlined 3 major goals for Amazon Creek. Flood conveyance. We still want to protect the community. We don't want to just, say, oh, that's it. Sorry you bought your house there. So flood conveyance and protecting the community from flood is still an important goal. Water quality is an important goal. We are, I mentioned earlier, the Clean Water Act is important for us to make sure that we meet. So we're trying to improve water quality, and we have certain things that we're really targeting around water quality. And then the third principle, which was not required, but the community really came around, which is habitat protection and natural resource enhancement. And those goals, as you're starting to get an image of, are in conflict. If we were just focused on flood conveyance, we'd build a giant pipe out to Fern Ridge Reservoir. So all the trees that we put in the way and all the habitat that we create slows water down. And so how do we keep both of those things going? And that's the challenge that we have. And then the other guiding document that we use in parks and open space is our open waterway maintenance plans, which are really designed reach by reach, and they articulate all the issues and problems and opportunities and how you take care of each section of Amazon Creek. So it's a pretty comprehensive, very thick document that helps us with some of our, think about what we're doing. Do I want to get into management? Yeah, so let's get into management. So what do? These are some of the pictures of some of the kinds of things we do. One of the things that I think is pretty innovative is we have this program called Green Piping, where we start at the top of Amazon Creek, actually all of our waterways now, and we have a crew walk right down the channel, and they prune trees in kind of a pipe shape. So there's still the trees are still rooted into the bank, they're still providing soil holding and keeping the structure of the creek in place. They're providing shade and habitat and closure, and yet there's a nice flow channel down the middle for flood conveyance. So there's not just a tangle of trees and shrubs that are blocking water and catching leaves and garbage and stuff and blocking the flow. And it's very kind of custom pruning, if you would. That's a program that we have every year. We do a lot of mowing. Our mowing we try to be targeted about our mowing. We have to mow fire breaks, and we have to mow sight lines and a few things like that. But we also, like prairies, we really try and delay mowing as much as we can to allow all of the native plants to go to seed and for wildlife to finish, reproducing and all of. And so we won't mow till August or September. In some years, and then we're also doing a lot of alternating year mowing, also not mowing at all for a year or two, and trying to experiment with that and trying to think about mowing Only on the levees. So downstream from Royal Avenue, when they're on the levees, which are actually constructed above the ground, that's where we are doing a lot more aggressive tree removal and more thoughtful tree removal, and it's complicated. We're still pushing back with Army Corps, and we're still trying to work it out. I think we could have willows, but big giant Douglas fir that's going to fall over in a windstorm, we can't. The rest of Amazon Creek, we're going for it, and we still haven't quite got agreement with Army Corps about that, but they haven't. The power that they have is they can say that we are no longer viable to receive flood insurance, which affects a lot of people who live by the creek. So they haven't done that yet. So far, they're okay with what we're doing, although we're kind of out of compliance with what they've asked us to do. We do habitat restoration, so the lower bottom right picture is it's not Amazon Creek, obviously, but we're putting in turtle logs for basking. So we do a lot of habitat enhancement. We do bank repair. I mentioned nutria caused the channel to fall down, and you can see the grade all sitting on the bike path here. We're about to lose the bike path if we didn't repair that. And it's a real problematic thing. We have to repair that. The only way to repair that it was with something hard like rock. We've got a whole bunch of different techniques. We try to use a softer approach, but it ends up being harder than the channel. And so what it does is when water hits that, it would bounce across the channel, and we're going to have a failure downstream on the opposite side of the channel, 50 yards, because the way hydrology works just kind of bounces its way down. So it's not a great solution. We do a lot of monitoring. We do tree planting. We collect seeds. We have a huge native plant program where we're doing restoration, especially in West Eugene, and a little bit in our area here, but Amazon Park, that kind of area. We haven't taken on the Parkway yet, but we will someday. And then we do large capital projects to totally change the structure of Amazon Creek. So we just actually a great place to go check out if you have time is between Garfield and Chambers and Garfield. We laid the banks back. We made so much capacity there. So now the creek can move around, and it's got the room to move around. And it has a lot of capacity, so we don't have to worry about flooding as much in that area. We can let the trees grow. We can let all kinds of things happen. Something I didn't say we do a lot of is debris removal. There's a lot of garbage. We do it all the time. So that's why you don't see as many tires and shopping carts and junk, but because we're yanking them out all the time. Bikes, all the time. Continuous work. So that's everything I really wanted to say. But if you have questions or comments or things that you want to talk about, I'd love to hear them. Yeah.
Does the city go all the way out to Fern Ridge?
Good question. The city limits are at Royal, actually at Green Hill, I should say, at Green Hill. They go north of Royal. But we own the channel to Fern Ridge. So we have a responsibility, and we actually own the channel even though it's outside the city limits.
I'm curious about the crayfish. I mean, not that you would know the answer, but why are they so different, the personalities?
I don't know why. I'm sure that wherever they came from, that benefited them in some way. They've evolved to have those kinds of traits. And
do you think that the more passive ones would adapt and become more aggressive to get a balance back, but that doesn't happen?
Evolution can happen, but it takes a little bit of time, and so that's often the issue. With plants, I don't know. I'm not going to speak to how quickly evolution happens, but it's a little bit slower than a lot of these invasive species are coming in. Yeah.
So you mentioned a couple minutes ago that eventually you thought you'd get up to the upper Amazon Creek for further development.
Restoration, you mean?
Yeah, restoration.
Yeah.
So what would be your vision of the optimal form of restoration that could take place up in here?
Yeah, we're limited. There's the road. There's a couple things I would like to see us do. I'd like to see us take those banks down a little bit so it's not just steep banks. And then we could do restoration of the prairie itself. Now that will end up being challenging to do, in order to do prairie restoration, the techniques that we've used often involve herbicides, and this community in this area is not going to be as open to that. I think we'll get a lot of resistance. In West Eugene, we've been very successful. We've taken, we can take a grass seed field that's, out of farm production where it's been hit with herbicides for decades, use herbicides for 2 or 3 years, and end up with a completely restored prairie, 90 plus native species, 98% native cover, unheard of restoration. No one else in the valley has been doing that level of restoration, but it takes a pretty heavy hand up front. And so if we were to get rid of, it's tall fescue right now. To get rid of tall fescue in a way that would be effective would likely involve herbicides. So we haven't, and the benefit is limited because it's so narrow. It's not like we're creating a giant habitat, a giant anchor for habitat, and we're going to bring in meadowlarks and all kinds of grassland birds. It's such a narrow strip. The benefit for that cost would be a challenge. But we could do some stuff with the creek, similar to what we did up at Frank Kinney, I think.
Are you familiar with some of the reported effects of introduction of cellular transmitters, especially large cellular transmitters, in areas where wildlife is so vital and obviously being impacted already, especially when it comes to the difference between the large towers and the micro towers that are clearly a more expensive alternative for the industry?
It's a good question. It's really out of my expertise. I don't really know enough about electromagnetic radiation, and I think the science is pretty young on it. Personally, that's my knowledge of the science. Maybe there's more there, but I haven't read a whole lot of great research that's come down one way or the other. It's been, maybe you know more.
I promised Trevor that we would not put him on the spot about that topic tonight. So we're really just focused on the.
I didn't.
It's a good question.
That's fine. That's all right. That's all right. He's a big boy. He can handle it.
What about though the herbicides to get rid of that grass, because they're discovering now that the herbicides are very water soluble and are dramatically impacting the fish population and causing male fish to lay eggs?
It's a great question. And
So that sounds like it imbalances the rest.
you would think that. But each herbicides are very complicated, and they're all very different. And, people are like, well, you use herbicides, you lose bees. Well, if you use neonicotinoids, a specific kind of herbicide, you impact bees. There are specific herbicides that are causing those kinds of problems,
Right.
in particular broadleaf herbicides, and some of the heavy-duty ones that a lot of farmers use. We're really focusing a lot of our work with glyphosate, which, it's terrible. It's a Monsanto product. But it breaks down very quickly. We're finding, it's got 20 years of research, pretty good research, not just industry research, but real scientific research from good, well-designed studies. It breaks down really quickly. If you use glyphosate, not the commercial product. The commercial product, Roundup and Rodeo, Roundup in particular comes with a surfactant. The surfactant helps it stick. The surfactant breaks down into things that bioaccumulate, especially in aquatic microinvertebrates. They've found that, and they're finding this in areas where, the application rate is ridiculous. You use it in a commercial, the way we would use it, we use like 1% solution. They'll go out and they'll spray a 20-25% solution into water, and then they're barely finding any trace of it, but they are finding a trace of it. And it's the surfactant. So what the city does is we're taking just the active ingredient, which no studies have really shown there's not very many impacts unless you're, swimming in it or something. Those people have eye problems when you spray glyphosate directly in your eye. Of course, you can spray anything in your eye and have that. And then we use a soy-based surfactant as the sticking agent to have it stick. Are there impacts? Probably. I probably think that there are. Are those impacts, how dramatic are they? I don't know. I don't think they're that dramatic based on the research that I know, and also based on the alternative of, when I compare it to losing biodiversity, when I compare it to, you know,
They're
the
actually doing new things though, where they're using, not herbicides, but very effectively killing those grasses with, combined.
she's saying that there's different ways of killing grasses
Yeah.
besides
They're
herbicides.
using, some natural soaps and paired with.
Yeah, they don't work.
Epsom salts.
They don't work. We've just received we've been for 15 years had about $400,000 EPA grant focused on different techniques for restoring prairies. We've looked at dozens and dozens of different methods of chemicals, of burning, of using plastics to cover them, clear plastics to solarize, dark plastics to smother. I mentioned burning. I mentioned mycorrhizae, different acids, different vinegars, different chemicals, different oils, and a lot of those oils are actually worse. You know, like a lot of these tree oils actually cause biological degradation of the soil biota, and that's one of the bigger issues. Even vinegar, this sort of like your burnout, those kinds of things that are natural, they biodegrade very quickly, but they destroy the soil biota. The least toxic thing we found was glyphosate. You may find that surprising.
Did you look at the effective microorganism technology from Japan?
Microorganism technology?
Effective microorganism is a method of fermentation and techniques of restoring
Grasslands?
all kinds of stuff. You name it, really.
I'm not familiar with that.
You should check
Sounds interesting.
EM, they call it EM.
Okay.
Does the city have a native plant nursery?
We do. Yeah, Alden Baker Park. If you ever want to volunteer there, Friday afternoons we have volunteers, or if you just want to take a tour, it's really pretty cool. It's pretty small.
Friends of Beaufort Park has one.
Yeah.
It's about 300 pounds of seed a year.
Yeah, ours is much smaller. We have contractors throughout the valley growing seed for us, actually similar ones. We use Pacific Northwest natives. We have Heritage, and we also, because we have a partnership with the Bureau of Land Management, have a lot of plants experimentally grown out of the Plant Materials Center up in Corvallis. So yeah, we go through thousands of pounds of seed every year. I think this year we produced and put out 1,200 pounds. But our little native plant nursery only put out like 50. I mean, it's more specialty, really small scale things that like the candy that we really want to make sure we get, but we don't need a lot of. I don't know who had their hands up.
I've heard it along the Amazon, particularly from the fairgrounds west, for decades. And what I used to see there were all kinds of shorebirds, from the herons on down to very small shorebirds, when it was allowed to dry out. You know, and now that it's being managed with the pools and all that, I used to have residential snipes there, all kinds of stuff.
I'm sorry, what area? I'm sorry.
From the fairgrounds west along the
Okay.
Amazon Canal.
Okay.
And so now they put in all those, the rocks and the
Oh,
pooling and
okay.
all that stuff. And so those shorebirds are gone. It's very rare. Occasionally one will stop by or do something, but that's one thing I noticed when they started doing that. I went, there goes all the mud, because it was a small mudflat situation.
Yeah.
It just would dry out. And it was perfect
Yeah.
for seeing all those kinds of creatures, but those are gone now with the change in how they want to manage it.
That's interesting.
And I don't know if that was dictated by the Corps or dictated by you.
The restoration work was done by us. We're kind of learning. Don't get it always right. Every time I think we do a little bit better, but I just saw today a nice, what I would like to have seen at the Garfield to Chamber area. We got it wide enough, but it still all kind of slopes to the main channel, and I think it would have been neat if we had like a little floodplain with maybe a little depression, so water would go up there and kind of pool, like a vernal pool. That might create the kind of conditions like you're talking about. We didn't do that. Next time.
It's gotta be hard to do the balance, to figure it all out.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
So you get the big bucks.
It's my career. learning. I get to learn every time I do something because I do it wrong.
Could you speak to the types of fish that are in the upper part?
Good question. Yeah, mostly non-native. Everything basically from Fern Ridge up to about here is non-native. Like mosquito fish and there's some carp and things like that.
Gray ones that are so prevalent?
Mosquito fish probably.
Is that what that is?
There are reports, and I've heard this report frequently enough that it could be real, that there is a resident population of trout in the upper Amazon part, that they don't migrate. They're a resident population, which is possible. They're known to do that. I've never seen them, but I've heard, several different people have told me that, and so it could be an urban legend that's cycling, but they might be there, and it's possible. Yeah. Yeah, in the back. Sorry, you've had your hand up a long time.
You mentioned endangered species in the Amazon Creek. What about endangered birds and vertebrates or animals?
Good question, yeah. So in the Willamette Valley, basically the main endangered species that we have in Eugene, we have several plants. So we have Bradshaw's lomatium, we have Willamette daisy, and then we have Kincaid's lupin. Kincaid's lupin is interesting because it's the host plant for the Fender's blue butterfly. So that's the first animal in our area that was listed. We haven't had any animals listed for a long time, except for we had bald eagles. They started moving in when they were endangered. Now they're not. So Fender's blue butterfly and the Kincaid's lupin are kind of a duo. And then recently, the streak-torn lark was just listed last year. This is a bird found in West Eugene. It kind of likes weird places, likes really disturbed areas. It's actually one of the larger populations that we have in Eugene is at the airport because they mow it and there's gravel roads everywhere. They like the gravel. And the airport doesn't like it because it's an endangered species and they've got airplanes and things like that they're trying to deal with. But that's it. There aren't a lot of other animals in Eugene that are endangered. Obviously there's salmon in the Willamette River, and then, like I mentioned, formerly the bald eagle was. We have a few bald eagles here, but now they've been delisted. There are a lot of rare plants and animals, though, that are not listed. So I should say that we manage a lot of things that are listed as sensitive, like western pond turtle is a great example. Declining dramatically, should be listed. They're not. They're listed as sensitive on the state list, but we try to manage for them. And there's a few other things. Western pond turtle. Delta Ponds is full of them. If you go to Delta Ponds, you'll likely see them.
I think they were proposed again last year.
Yeah.
For listing, so the determination is probably going to be another year.
Yeah, at least. Right. It takes a long time, but.
There used to be muskrat along there before there were so many nutria. There used to be a lot of muskrat.
That's right. That's a big competition, I think.
Right.
I see muskrat populations decline where we have large nutria populations. Somebody over here had their hand up. Jill.
I'm curious to know if you know someone in the city or if you know who is working with the Roosevelt YMCA project for the riparian zone that you worked on restoring, but then as it moves through and before it hits the channel, if they're doing a lot of building there, I noticed that they schedule the mowing pretty well, like to keep the short grass like it's longer than, how much of that do you know is being,
Can be developed
yeah,
with the Roosevelt School.
yeah, and the YMCA?
Yeah, so the YMCA is going to move into the old Roosevelt,
Okay.
and then the new Roosevelt's going to be constructed in that area, and it's going to be. I haven't seen the actual footprint, but they're pushing it right up against. I wish I had a better image.
Where the tennis courts are.
Yeah, they're basically the line at the edge of the tennis courts. I think that's going to be the edge of the building. So like right up against the trees, and then almost to the bike path, as far as how far south they go, and that's a lot of wetland area. So.
Yeah, well, what about all the place across from 39th and Lambert, all that big acreage of the graveyard, that they're now going to put a big housing complex in? I mean, it has streams, it has movement, it has
Yeah.
butterflies, it has, how will that impact the balance? I'm just curious, because it's all
Yeah.
in pieces, and one piece falls and another and another.
Yeah, it's death by 1,000 cuts, really. That's private land.
Yeah,
So it'll be managed, there's the whole fairness thing. Well, I bought my land and you let them develop, and how come I can't develop? And, if I were the property owner, I'd understand that. But yeah. We've been buying a lot of land when we can. And really, we're still buying land. We're really targeting now a lot of ridgeline properties out of the city, actually. And part of that makes, the urban growth boundary that we have the reason that we're able to keep it intact is to allow infill and development. We've protected quite a bit of land, but if we protect all the land, then that pushes housing and development out into the other areas. And when you look around our urban growth boundary, we're surrounded by sensitive habitats in every direction. You know, the current UGB expansion discussion that's happening with planning, they're pushing light industrial out towards the airport. That's all wetlands. You know, it's pretty beat up wetlands, and I think that's probably the best direction to go personally, but it's all wetlands. If you go south, it's all oak habitat and oak prairies and savannas, and farther west is more wetland prairies, so there's not a lot of directions to go. So infilling isn't not a bad idea. It does have an impact every time you take a tree down. And turn it into concrete.
Oh, I just want to say thank you for the work you've done, especially at the Frank Kinney Park, because it's beautiful, the restoration. I've seen that area ever since I was a little kid. And
Oh, good.
It's really
That's
changed
a
a
long time.
lot.
Yeah.
For the better.
Good.
And also, I'm really happy about the Headwaters acquisition, because that, like you said, that corridor is just wonderful for the wildlife. And I just wondered, there's so much camas at certain times during the spring up there. Is camas at all on the endangered list?
No, camas is extremely common. It's a really great plant. It was used to be, it was one of the central Native American food staples. One of the reasons that they were, all of the Willamette Valley tribes actually, but Kalapuya too, which was the tribe here, one of the reasons that we believe they burned was to facilitate camas production. After you burn, camas produces a tremendous amount of flowers, which therefore produces seed, and then the next year there's more plants. So I think that was probably one of the driving factors. That and another plant that they use, tarweed, also really likes to be burned and really has benefits from being burned. But it's common. It's it's small populations up here because it's been kind of beaten out. But
It is nice on that stretch from Frank Kinney down to Fox Hollow, that part.
yeah, there's a nice population left still. It takes a long time to grow too. From the time you plant a seed to you see a flower is probably 5 or 6 years.
The Army Corps of Engineers authority is based on the early work they did, or on flood control, or wetlands, or
we signed an agreement with them in the 1950s when they built it that we would take care of it, and this is how we would take care of it, and they would give us flood insurance if we took care of it that way. Or allow us to have, they would rate us a certain way that would allow us to get flood insurance. So that's the connection. And I don't want to totally badmouth the Corps of Engineers because they've really worked with, they've been patient with us, letting us do a lot of really unusual, unorthodox things. We've been growing trees in Amazon Creek now for 15 years, and they kind of look the other way. They shake their finger, but they haven't, done anything. And now they're really working with us. The best thing that has happened is they legally considered everything that they did to be a levee. And I'm like, how can you consider Amazon Park a levee? It's flat. The water is ditched down below, but the banks are not a levee. If the water, there's no downhill side of it. And they finally come around to agreeing with that in terms of how they've defined their levees. They've redone that. And so now the levee system only starts basically at the Royal area. And a lot of their emphasis really came with Katrina. All of their levee failures there and all of the lawsuits that resulted from that made them, suddenly more stand up and be like, we can't let you do that anymore. We've been looking the other way with all your tree growing and crazy restoration stuff, but we gotta dial it in because we don't want that to happen again. And so we've been negotiating a lot more with them, and I think we're in a good place now. It's a better place as far as more reasonable management.
Is there any effort to get rid of the nucleus?
Good. They really breed fast. God. So we have done some trapping, actually, in delta ponds. So some of you may be familiar with the delta ponds. We were restoring that area for 10 years. We planted 150,000 trees and shrubs out there, just a tremendous amount, and they they were mowing them down like grass. In fact, I had a graduate student put out a camera, and it was really awesome. He put it right in this area where we planted, and we caged some plants, and we had some plants uncaged. And in the middle of the night, the nutria came right up in front of the camera, and he climbed up on the cage, and he kind of shook it, and he kind of, and then he turned around, and he just nipped off the one that was not caged. Just right in front of the camera. It was perfect. So that's why you see all those cages out there. It looks like a bunch of plastic garbage, but that's what's, and then we trapped nutria for about a year. Their populations are back up, but just to let us get the plants established, just to give us a little bit of window.
You should get them some kind of birth control. You know, some kind of thing that you could feed them where they wouldn't. But this has nothing to do with the nutria, but what is the thing with owls and crows? If you get an owl on your property, crows will come in from miles around and start dive bombing the trees, and it goes on for hours. I mean, it's like this big violent.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen that?
Not so much, but I do know that because, I mean, they do that with a lot of other raptors too. They're just, like, they don't want the raptors to get their young, probably, it's my guess, and they work together. They can really work together collaboratively. Crows really team up. That's my only thought. I'm not quite an expert on birds. Someone else might know.
The nutria are edible,
Well, so there's a few people in town here I know who eat them. And also, if you catch one, by Oregon state law, you can't let it go. So.
Well, thank you, Trevor.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Great, I really appreciate it. This is great.
Good. Yeah.
It's an opportunity to go out and know more what we're looking at.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. Yeah.
And, we have more food still, if anybody would like to hang around.
So, do you work with Gary for the...
Gary Dorsey? Yeah, I've worked with Gary for a long time.
And then Kat, or...
Kat Beal?
Yeah.
She works out, so they're both more in the wildlife area as opposed to the regulatory arm. Army Corps has 3 different arms. They manage a bunch of land, and they manage the dams. They have an engineering arm which builds stuff, and then they have a regulatory arm which you have to go to them and get a wetland fill permit. So I've actually had situations where the Army Corps came in and told us, you have to, oh, this was the funny thing. So we did this creek restoration project. We wanted to plant it. The Army Corps engineering arm said, you can't plant it because the trees and all that issues around that I explained to you. And then the permitting arm came in and said, you have to plant trees in there. So I'm like, you guys get your story straight.
So I work for the Forest Service seasonally from April to December, and we're working on a big wetland restoration. You know where Cougar Dam is?
Yeah.
South Fork Dam?
Yeah.
So just below the dam, we're working on doing like a 2-mile section of stream restoration, like really just redoing it all.
Cool.
But a lot of that property is Army Corps an agreement because they have monitoring stations and so forth down there. So we get, we talk to Garrett. Garrett's like, yeah, you're all good, or this would be great for wildlife or something. But then our fisheries person will talk to I assume either the permitting or the engineering side of things, and they're like, no, you can't do that. So now we've just got all these conflicting things.
Yeah, right.
It's so frustrating. But we're just dealing with the Forest Service and Army Corps. I couldn't imagine what you deal with private landowners, state, because you have to work with. There's a lot of state land and BLM. It's a nightmare.
A lot of it. Yeah, you too. Yeah, thanks for coming. Good to see you.
So it sounds like we have to do a little bit of violence to the creek if we want to restore back to the native.
If you want the prairies in particular, forest is easy to plant. You can plant trees and shrubs, and you can get a forest
But for it to
fairly
be-
easy. Prairies are hard to restore, and the reason is because these non-native grasses and in general, I should say the understory, the ground level vegetation is very hard to manage. That goes for forests too. So we go to our conifer forests here. Our most difficult invasive species are that ground level geraniums and false brome and things like that. I mean, we have no tools. There's nothing we can do, and they'll devastate. I mean, it will be, you go to areas in Corvallis, and false brome is like this carpet. There's not another plant in there. It's just
But that's
for,
survival of the
for
fittest.
30, 40 acres.
That's evolution in action, right?
It's true. Yeah, yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks
Paul. Sure. Yeah, I mean, we take biodiversity, we run it through a narrow sieve, and then what happens?
Yeah.
And maybe it will. Someday it will. Someday it'll come out again. Evolution will continue after humans are gone, I'm sure. But my personal objective is to try and save the pieces. There's a lot of ecosystem services that we depend upon that biodiversity is helping provide.
Are there any things that us who live in the area could organize around to support this vision?
I feel like we have so much support. I really love working in this community.
Yeah.
People. This is common response. People love the natural area here, and I don't have very many barriers from Eugene citizens. So more money, always, but we're not suffering. We're not suffering there either. We're doing all right. But
Well,
yeah.
this was really great.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Does the Army Corps preempt state stuff, and does the state stuff preempt local stuff?
Essentially.
Even in this, in
Yep.
this environment also?
Essentially, I mean, it's a little embarrassing when the state and federal government are in conflict with each other. But I've had several situations where I've actually, working with Delta Ponds, for example, there were some weird state fish regulations that were just with the state that were coming into play